with Roman numeral 2 in the outline. Charles Darwin is a very important name you need to remember because Charles Darwin was the father of our modern day, the modern day evolution concept was what he came up with in the middle 1800s. So this is him during the time that he was sailing around. So what you want to know is listed in your outline about him. So HMS Beagle voyage. The HMS Beagle was his ship, and he took a very long voyage. You can see in red the route that he went. He was only 22, so if you're 22 or you're almost going to be 22, just think about manning. You're basically a captain of the ship, and you are riding around the world, and you're cataloging and studying all these different animals on the planet. Actually, I take that back. I don't know if he was the captain, but he was definitely on that ship. He had a biology degree, and what he did was he basically set out and just took different specimens of all living things that he could get his hands on. He organized them, he tagged them, he took careful notes about them. So he just made a catalog of different organisms from all over the planet. His most important work, so letter C, I mentioned that, his most important work was basically when he got to this Galapagos Islands, his most famous work. And the Galapagos Islands are a little archipelago. An archipelago is just a collection of small islands that are very close to each other off the coast of South America. So here we have that cluster of islands. So in this area, he saw that organisms, were very, very similar to organisms that lived on South America. So you see the coast of South America is really not that far away from the Galapagos Islands, and he saw a lot of similarities between the organisms there. So the island organisms and the marine. So this is one example of that. And marine iguanas and land iguanas. So he saw the land iguanas, right? These iguanas that live on land on the mainland of South America. But then on the Galapagos Islands, he noticed a very, very similar creature, this marine iguana, but it lived in the water, right? Or it fished and hunted in the water, and it evolved adaptations for being in the water. So he had, this iguana here had finned digits, so webbing in between the digits, whereas the land iguana did not. So this would help this guy swim in the water, and there's other adaptations you can't physically see, but you can see how similar they are. So this got him thinking, like, why is it that we have such similar looking creatures, one on the mainland, one on these islands? Could they have been one species before and then sort of diverged based on where they lived, right? So that's the thought. So another thing that he studied, another organism that he studied, was these Galapagos finches. So under number 2, he got these insights from his voyages. So changes that occur to organisms over time is due to pressure from nature. The environment that the organisms live will determine what traits an organism has will be passed on or not. Nature selects for those organisms with the traits that survive and shapes what the organism looks like in the future. So let's take a look at an example of this. The beak size is on the Galapagos Islands. So these finches are all the same kind of bird. They have different shapes of beaks though, right? So this is a large ground finch with a very large beak. This is a warbler finch with a tiny little delicate beak. This is the woodpecker finch with yet a different sort of intermediate sized beak, right? And he's using a tool. So what he saw was that these finches had beaks adapted to their food, basically. So this ground finch would have to crack nuts that fell onto the ground, and they were very hard, and so you'd have to have a powerful beak to crack this open. The warbler finches would eat softer foods like berries, and the woodpecker finch would have to peck at trees and get the insects out. So each one of these finches had an adaptation to their island. They were on different islands, they had different food sources, and they had different adaptations to that. So that was something that he noticed also. This is an actual collection of his finches that are still around today, right? So you can see all the careful notes that he took. And so because of his travels on the HMS voyage and these cataloging of organisms, he came up with these ideas. Number one, organisms best suited to their environment survive and pass on their traits. All species tend to produce more offspring than the environment can support, which leads to competition. And number three, organisms in a population vary, and much of this variation is heritable. So let's look at number one. So organisms best suited to their environment, right? So this is that beak. We can look at the beak, right? So if you had a very dainty, small beak, and you lived on the environment where your beak had to be larger, say like this size, because you needed to crack open nuts, there was nothing else available to you, maybe there are no soft berries on that island, then this would be a disadvantage to you. You might not get enough to eat, you might not have children because you're too weak or too skinny, you might not be able to find a mate, and then you die. And when you die, your beak size dies with you because your genes did not move on to a next generation. So if you didn't have children, right, if this bird never mated, then that beak size is going to, the genetics of that beak size is going to die with that bird. So it's never going to get passed on to the next generation. So when you say organisms best suited to their environment, right, so whatever you have physically, right, we know that the physical phenotype is due to some kind of genetic genotype. So if your phenotype, if you physically are fit for your environment and what you have, your abilities or what you look like is best suited to your environment, then you're going to pass on those genes to the next generation. They're going to be similar to you. But if you don't, right, if you don't have those traits, then they're probably going to die with you because they were unfit for your specific environment. Now, this is not to say that there is one very best kind of organism out there. If this finch, right, were to, well, let's say this larger beaked finch, if we were to pluck him out of his island and put him on an island where he had to use a tool and peck open, tree bark to find insects, maybe this beak is not perfect for that, right, or this beak here. So as long as you're in your environment where your traits are suited for, you're going to survive. If you're plucked out of your environment and you're put somewhere else, then all of a sudden your traits are not best suited for your environment. Or if your environment changes, then that is also something that's not so good, right? If your environment changes and physically you no longer are the best fit individual for your environment, then you may also die. And your traits will die with you. Number two, all species tend to produce more offspring than the environment can support, which leads to competition. So you have to imagine that out there in the world, organisms are competing with each other all the time, whether it's animals or plants. Plants will oftentimes, block each other's growth with their roots. Sometimes they'll be very aggressive in, choking off another plant. So whatever it is, there's always going to be some kind of competition with the resources that there are on the planet. Organisms in the population vary. So if you think about any population, so let's stop and redefine what is a population. A population is a group of the same species in a given geographical area, right? Because remember I was saying you can talk about the population of people on LAVC campus, or you can talk about the population of Los Angeles, or you can talk about the population of North America. So if you're looking at this population of ladybugs, you can see that not every ladybug is the same, right? Their color is slightly different, the markings on their back is slightly different, and these are just things that we can see. They're different sizes. But what can we not see? Maybe we can't see the odors that they secrete, the certain chemicals that they secrete. Maybe we can't understand their intelligence levels. But there are going to be various different kinds of ladybugs or any individual in a population. So out of this, right, this is what you're pulling from. Out of this, how does nature affect what you look like, right? So if the environment really likes these darker red ladybugs, but because for some reason there's an insect or a predator out there that really likes the lighter color, then the darker colored ladybugs will fare better, right? But there's always going to be some kind of variation within a population. Okay, so here's a concept check. Darwin proposed the theory of natural selection as the mechanism of evolution based on 3 observations about nature. Which of the following were part of Darwin's observations? So you can pause the video to think about it, or I'll just tell you the answer right now. It's all the above. So if you go back to the previous slide, each one of these A, B, and C were part of his observations. Okay, so what is natural selection? So it's turn. So natural selection is basically this, you probably heard this before, right? Those individuals with traits best suited to the local environment generally leave a larger share of surviving fertile offspring. And so what this really means is that there is unequal reproductive success. Every individual, so if we go back to this ladybug scenario, do all these ladybugs have the potential to reproduce exactly the same? Are they all going to have 5 ladybug kids? No, right? Because there are going to be lots of factors that come into play, whether, you know, what ladybugs are going to be healthy, get a secure home, different things like that. So we're going to have to say that all those ladybugs are not going to be able to reproduce equally. So there's unequal reproductive success, which is what natural selection is, right? So every individual of a population is not going to be able to reproduce equally. And those that reproduce are probably going to be the better suited for their environment because they have the access to a mate, they have the health, they're healthy individuals in order to have children, especially the females, right? They have to be very healthy in order to have an offspring. You have a safe place. You've reached the age where you can have offspring. So all those little different factors are going to contribute to whether an organism is passed on or has children, and those genes are passed on to the next generation. So what does it mean to be evolutionarily fit? It just means that you are able to have children, that you survive, you've had children, and you've passed on your genes to the next generation. And so that's a really bleak, if you think about like that definition, basically you win if you have kids, because that means that you, in the Darwinian sense, right, you have already gotten your genes into the next generation. And if they have children, your genes will be, you know, propelled into the future. And you win the evolution game. So to be evolutionary fit is basically to survive in your local environment enough to reproduce. So you can have your genes move on to the next generation. All right, so this is just a fun picture of some of these things we see over time of this co-evolution of flowers and insects. So this insect spends most of its time on this certain flower. The flower must offer some kind of benefit to the insect, and the insect offers some benefit to the flower. And so over time, the insect, if you can see it, there's the head, here's the antennas, this is the thorax, this is the body, and the abdomen, you know, so it's to protect that. I think it's a praying mantis from getting eaten. All right, so does natural selection happen today? Yes, it does. So it's happening all the time. And I think one of the most sort of stark examples of this now is with climate change, because when you have very rapid changes in climate, you also have rapid changes in waterfall. It's not only heat, but it's also, you know, waterfall. There are droughts, there are excessive storms. And so the environment is becoming very, very turbulent. And there are some organisms that have evolved over time to become very used to and to be very good at a certain environment. So a certain temperature range or a certain, you know, moisture range. And then when you throw that off, all of a sudden those organisms may not be best fit for that environment because you change the environment. And so you will start to see, you know, not in one generation's time, but over many, many years, that we'll start to have different organisms occupy different niches, and sometimes those organisms will change. There's thoughts that when the polar ice caps, if they do melt completely, that the polar bears that are white will actually go back to brown, because the brown fur, they actually began as brown bears, and now they're white because it helps them protect them in the snow. But if the snow goes away, they might start to go back to brown. Anyways, this is an example of natural selection. This is a pesticide resistance. So this is how the example goes. You have some cockroaches, And the cockroaches are going to get sprayed with a certain kind of pesticide, let's call it Raid, right? So just by chance, right, we talked about mutations. Mutations are just random little changes in DNA that happen. So just by chance, there's a mutation in this guy's DNA, this red gene here, right? So the blue would be the blue variant or allele. The red allele here, the red allele seems to be protective against this Raid. So all of the bugs, right, these cockroaches with the blue allele die, but those with the red allele survive. And so they get to mate because the environment changed on them. The environment now has Raid. But if you're best suited to your environment out of this population, it's the mutants that had that survival, just by chance, right? The survival gene, something changed and made them survive the Raid. They get to reproduce and sort of promote that gene into the future, right? So all the offspring are most likely to have that red allele. So you can actually see this allele change where the population before used to have mostly blue allele cockroaches. The environment changed and now we have another population with mostly red alleles. This is exactly how we get resistant bugs around us. So we have pesticide resistant insects. I may have told you this example before. I usually do with lice. So, because my daughter and I had lice when she was little, and they said that, you know, the lice medication, the shampoo just doesn't work anymore because that medication hasn't changed for decades. And so the lice population now basically just is resistant. So this is basically that example here: antibiotic resistant bacteria, drug resistant strains of HIV, drug resistant strains of tuberculosis. Those are all real life examples of this exact same mechanism working. All right, so let's see how you understand evolution. Evolutionary fitness is an often misunderstood concept. Which of the following imaginary individuals would have the greatest evolutionary fitness? So I'll give you a chance if you want to pause the video to think about it. Go ahead. Otherwise, I'm going to tell you the answer right now. When you look at the different sparrows, you see that the beak sizes are different, the lifespan is different, and then the offspring, right? So since we talked about how you win if you have kids, right? Because your genes are now into the future. You know, you established your gene in the future generations. Then the sparrow that's best fit in this example is the one with most offsprings. It's sparrow D. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, 16. 16 is the most offspring, so sparrow B is the correct answer. It's the sparrow with the most offspring. Okay, so what is it all about? It's eat, survive, reproduce. Eat, survive, reproduce, right? So that's, you know, in the strictest sense, you know, organisms on this planet, they need to eat, they need to survive, and they need to reproduce. All right, so next